Hello, today is Tuesday, February 16th, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. This is another podcast in our What to Watch in 2021 series. Today's topic focuses on enterprises' approach to getting a contract for their telecom services. And to cover it, I'm joined by Laura McDonald, a partner at LB3, and by my fellow TC2 director, Pat Gilpatrick. Hey, Laura and Pat, thanks for joining me today. Now, I don't mind pointing out that the three of us have been doing ICT and other telecom deals for a long time. So it's always interesting when a technology or a change in approach requires enterprises to think differently about their ICT contracts. What do you think, Pat?
Yes, Joe, it's always interesting to watch these shifts. And in today's environment, the financial structure for many services is changing. In the enterprise space for telecom services, the typical long-term contract structure, which is 36 months or more, has traditionally been a revenue commitment over a fixed period of time, either an annual commitment, volume commitment, or spend commitment, or a minimum term revenue or volume commitment over the term of the contract. This means the customer has to buy a certain amount of services. So the parties spend a lot of time determining what services are contributory to the commitment, what was the existing spend, what's the projected spend going to be, what's the right revenue commitment level. And these are all highly negotiated elements which underlie the business case for both parties, the client and the supplier. Well, with these deals comes a degree of flexibility for the client. So long as the revenue threshold is met, they can retire it by any number of services. And this worked well when services under contract were longer term, private network services like dedicated voice platforms, MPLS infrastructure, dedicated private lines. But we've seen a shift over the last couple of years to contracting more services under individual circuit terms as clients migrate to more internet-based services. So there are contractual and financial implications of this shift.
Okay, so Laura, as the attorney in the house, how about if you tell us about some of the more important critical implications of all this?
Joe, happy to. Let me first spend 5 seconds on what is a circuit term. And these go by many names: service period, minimum payment period, service term. For today's conversation, we'll use circuit term. When a customer places an order, the supplier requires on the circuit term environment, on an element basis, say an access or port, that the customer commit to purchase it at a fixed price for a specific period of time. And this often involves a quote unquote take or pay requirement over the term, which means you're financially obligated to pay for that circuit or element for the entire designated term, whether it remains installed or not. And in some cases, whether or not it properly works or whatever it's connected to properly works. So as you've already inferred, this leads to a number of potential risks. First, unless you're careful, those terms can be 2 or 3 years long or even longer. Second, if you're already under an aggregate volume commitment contract structure with that supplier, with shortfall and early termination and all the things that Pat talked about, this creates an additional layer of liability for circuit disconnects or moves that happen with the term. So that undoes some of the flexibility that Pat was talking about. In addition, the individual circuit terms carry individual expiration dates based on the in-service period. So you measure from when it's accepted or in place until the end of that service term, which means you have to keep track of each circuit and its term, making the governance of these services more complex. And to add to that, the supplier's tendency is to have these automatically renew, which means that, unless you scream in time and in the right way, if you had signed up for a 2-year term, it's extended for another 2-year term. So this extends financial obligations, and it makes it harder to handle and much stickier than most customers want, which is exactly the goal of the supplier.
So it sounds like this isn't a customer-friendly scenario. Why would clients want to do that?
Well, the trade-off is flexibility, but the big if is whether you can negotiate the right kinds of terms around these individual circuit term orders. First of all, the benefits of the structure are that best-in-class circuit orders should not be any longer than 12 months. This means after a year, any circuit can be upgraded, moved, disconnected, no penalties involved, and no fear of it negatively impacting some kind of overall revenue commitment to the supplier. If you're buying more commoditized service, like dedicated internet access, you maintain your leverage over your supplier because you can move the service or at a minimum, you can shop for better price performance on an annual basis. But like I said, to optimize this process, you need to have the right terms in place around these kinds of plans, and they shouldn't be longer than a year in length.
Pat, that's absolutely on point. So let's talk a little bit about what some of those terms should be. In order to maximize the upsides that Pat points out and minimize the downsides that I did, in addition to all the normal stuff, there's a few significant terms that you need to negotiate under this structure. You have to look at what is the pricing at the end of the circuit term and what happens at the end of the overall contract term. So let's first look at the individual circuit term goes. For that, the best practice is to have the pricing remain stable into the end of the contract term. So you're committed for the 12 months, but after that, the supplier has to provide it at the price and under the terms until the end of the contract term. This gives you flexibility. It allows you to migrate services that have completed their term and either to improve the pricing or upgrade the service. It also gives you less to manage. You only have to look at and manage for those 12 months. You don't have to worry about those auto renewals. There are other things that you can do as well if they don't agree to this, but I would argue that this approach is not bad for the suppliers because prices tend down and they've priced for a specific period. And if you keep it in longer than that, they should treat that as a bonus. Now, the fallback, if you can't get that, would be to convert to a month-to-month basis. So at the end of the circuit term, they still have to provide it to you at the rates unless they give you notice, hopefully very far in advance, like 90 days, that the pricing is going to change. On the flip side, what the suppliers want, and what is often in their form contracts, is that it converts to month-to-month rates at the end of the term. So you could see a big rise in your rates instead of going down. Or these auto renewals that Pat and I've already talked about. And as I said, the default is often either in the service guide or the service order form to divert to this auto renewal or the increased prices. The second issue that I mentioned was what happens at the end of the contract term. And this is what I call the hangover problem. You're going to install services in the last year of your contract. Almost no one has the discipline or able to control their services to do that. But if it's a 12-month term and you install it in month 6, what happens 6 months later when the contract terms? What you want is to, in best case, although hard to get, is to say at the end of that term, it's over. What is more realistic is that you might have to keep it in place for its 12-month term, but you still get the same rates, terms, and conditions until the end of that, not only for that element, but anything that's connected to it. Pat, you want to talk a little bit about early termination liability in this scenario?
Yes, I'd be happy to. With any circuit term that you're successful in getting a 12-month period, it is usually take or pay. But if you agree to something longer, the early termination language should absolutely reflect a significant reduction, 50% or less of the monthly charges over the number of remaining months. And that significantly reduces your financial obligation. It's also really important that the term period does not recast or start over if the circuit or the port is upgraded to a higher speed using the same local access. I'll also add to your discussion about hangover circuit terms, it's best to try to negotiate a coterminous clause for anything that's been in the ground for more than 12 months so that you don't have that hangover problem.
So I'm curious, why is this contracting shift happening? I mean, what's changed?
Joe, as you've noted, the three of us have spent a lot of time negotiating these types of agreements. And so we're used to seeing these pendulum swings. And they're driven by a number of factors. And in this case, I see several things that are driving it. First of all, technology changes. There are more and more procurement activities for internet services, particularly with the rise of SD-WAN and the decline of MPLS. And internet services are more commoditized, and thus they're more easily sourced and priced with these type of circuit term commitments. The other is supplier changes. We're seeing more non-incumbents competing successfully in this space. So when a new supplier with only one service is involved, whether it be broadband or DIA or Ethernet connection, circuit terms have become kind of the standard contract structure.
Yes, and also the flexibility that I talked about. While suppliers want to tie you to their services as long as possible, clients benefit from the flexibility to move, upgrade, and disconnect these services without worrying about the impact of meeting that overall revenue threshold. And to achieve this goal, customers are willing to move away from that one throat to choke large supplier providing everything and use more non-traditional suppliers. And in fact, in some areas, it's becoming a very competitive option.
So, Pat, what are some of the challenges that clients would have issuing RFPs and just getting competitive rates in this new environment you guys have described?
Well, getting the rates is not as difficult. You can get very competitive rates on these 12-month terms. The biggest challenge is getting the supporting terms and conditions around that 12-month structure to your advantage. So negotiating the rest of that story is really important. One of the other challenges we find when we come in and look at the baseline of services when we're helping clients through this is making sure to communicate to the entire enterprise that these prices and terms and conditions need to be followed for every order they place. All it takes is one business unit or some remote region procurement person to order something under a standard order form, and suddenly they're obligated for 24 months or more with all kinds of nefarious terms about renewal. So you really have to make sure that you can authorize the right kind of procurement across the globe once you get this in place.
So, Laura, what are the contracting challenges here?
Well, Joe, how much time do we have? Well, in the interest of time and the audience, I want to reiterate two things. One is to take advantage of the shift, and you can. You have to be prepared to have agreements with numerous suppliers. So build that into your timeline. Get the best terms you can in place to preserve your leverage and your flexibility. And then to Pat's point, develop a process for making sure new orders take advantage of that and that in your initial hard work. Second, I need to reiterate the importance of establishing the right order of precedence in your agreements. So the vendor's service order forms or other documents don't undermine all your hard work. What you don't want, and what they usually try and do, is hide the things you don't like and documents that people don't read carefully, like the service guide or the order forms. So make sure you read them because you only want good surprises. And of course, if anyone wants the longer version, I know any of the three of us are happy to talk about it.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thank you as well, Pat. Well, as you just heard, things will most likely be changing when you set out to negotiate your next telecom contract. And this might be the time where it makes some sense to bring in some help. And we obviously are ready to help. So please do contact Laura, Pat, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or sending us an email. And as always, you can stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected, checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.